Hello, bio students. We'll be starting into our lecture on principles of ecology. We've touched on a lot of these concepts already during class time, but now for some formalized lecture notes and some key terms. First of all, ecologists in ecology focuses mostly on relationships between organisms within a species or between different species and between these organisms and their environments. Ecologists study these environments at a variety of different levels of organization. The term ecology literally breaks down to the study of houses because it comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning house. Formally, the definition is that ecology is the study of the interactions among living things and their surroundings, i.e. their houses. So those levels of organization that I mentioned that biologists study come in a variety of levels, both from local to global. And we're going to start with the simplest level and work our way out. The most simple level of organization that ecologists will study are an individual organism, so an individual living thing. This might be beneficial if you're looking at a lone predator that travels by itself. We might like to study an individual organism for that reason. A population is when you have more than one of that same species. So, for example, the human population, but you can also have a population of trees or a population of fish of the same species. We know that these species do not live in isolation. They tend to live in communities or groups of different species that interact with each other in a variety of ways. For example, while we also consume vegetation as part of our daily diet, we also rely on this vegetation to produce oxygen and to take in the carbon dioxide that we exhale. Ecosystems are when you take into consideration all things non-living that impact these communities. So this includes all organisms as well as the climate, the temperature and precipitation or rainfall. Also, it takes into account things like soil and water and rocks, the type of rocks found in an area, or other non-living things. Similar ecosystems found around the globe are called biomes. So this is a global community. So for example, we live in a desert and there are other deserts around the globe that have similar species that have similar roles or niches within their ecosystem. So the deserts found all around the world form the desert biome. Same thing with tropical rainforests. There are ones in South America, but there are also ones in Africa. These make up the tropical rainforest biome. In addition, if you'll notice in the top right-hand corner of this PowerPoint slide, you'll see the term biosphere. This is when you take all of these biomes together. And this is the wedge of Earth that supports life. It's all areas where you find living things. We don't find living things in the core of the Earth, so the biosphere is kind of like the peel on an orange. It's just this outermost layer. Now, how do we find out information about these different levels of organization? Ecological research is our answer to this, and research can look differently depending on what the scientist is researching. So it includes certain methods like observations, experimentation, and modeling. These are all research methods that can be used in all other biological disciplines and all other scientific disciplines, but we're going to review them regardless. So ecologists will use observation, the act of carefully watching something over a long period of time. It could also be a short-term period as well. The long-term and short-term studies are important to tracking what's happening to different populations of organisms. We also use surveys to monitor and observe populations over time. We'll actually be doing some examples of this out in our community in the next couple of weeks. Experimentation is also a critical piece in ecological research. These experiments can be done in the lab or in the field. Lab experiments are more convenient. They give a researcher more control because you can do this in a lab setting. You don't have to travel anywhere. However, it's artificial, especially when we're considering ecology. You're looking at things out in the environment. You can only model this so much in a lab setting, but some experiments are more useful than others, which is why you also need to have field experiments. Field experiments give a more accurate picture, but they're more challenging because you have to travel outdoors. Sometimes it might be a specific season that you have to do your experiment, your field experiment within certain times of day. You usually have to find what is you're looking for first. You have to find an ideal location. So there's lots of factors that make this more challenging. Modeling is also a useful tool, and this uses computer and mathematic models to describe and model nature based on real data. We have a lot of information available to us. With the advent of GIS and smart technology, we can now track information in a very useful way. And so we can see how one variable affects another, such as temperature or carbon dioxide emissions and temperature that we see around the world. And we can create virtual ecosystems. Again, this is artificial, but it is very useful for predicting what might happen in a given environment. All right, so we mentioned ecosystems and how the ecosystem is the interaction between the living things in that area, those communities, and their non-living surroundings. We're going to give another name for that. Ecosystems include biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are living things. So you are a biotic factor, I'm a biotic factor, the tree outside is a biotic factor, a bee is a biotic factor, etc. Abiotic factors, using that same knowledge, we know that that prefix a means not. Abiotic factors are not living. So these are factors such as moisture, temperature, wind, sunlight, soil. Abiotic factors have an impact on the types of living things that are able to live in a given area. Below you can see cactus and different types of vegetation in what presumably is a desert ecosystem. Now we know deserts have warmer temperatures, less precipitation. These abiotic factors determine the kinds of desert species you will see in a given area. Changing some of these factors in the ecosystem can affect many other things, such as biodiversity. For example, we know that global warming is an issue. We're having rising temperatures. Certain living things can only live in a particular temperature range. So if it gets too warm, these living things will no longer be able to survive in a given environment. And this can in turn impact biodiversity, meaning the number of living things you find in an ecosystem. Not just number, but the types of numbers. So how many species you find in a given area. The amount depends on a variety of factors. Tropical rainforests have a large biodiversity. So they have a large percentage of species found in a very small fraction. And a lot of that is because their temperature range and precipitation range are very favorable to the majority of living things that we find. Within an ecosystem, you also have keystone species. Now, these are species that have an unusually large effect on an ecosystem. Arguably, all species are important to an ecosystem, but some might have a larger impact than others. They're part of more food chains, more food webs, etc. And loss of this species can cause a ripple effect that's felt across an entire ecosystem. If you'll notice below, you see a lot of pictures of vegetation. Producers or plants and other types of organisms are often keystone species because they form the base of all food chains. So if they're impacted, herbivores are impacted, and then the carnivores that eat those herbivores are impacted, etc. For example, it doesn't always have to be plants though, but right here we have a beaver in a wetland ecosystem. And beavers change the habitat for many other species by creating ponds. When they build their dams, they create ponds that are ecosystems for things like fish to find shelter from predators. You also find nesting sites for birds, things like that. If you take out this keystone species, you would no longer have the same number of nesting sites, and fish would be more susceptible to their predators. This can cause a large ripple effect across this ecosystem. Now, energy is a really important concept to understand as part of ecosystems. Energy moves through an ecosystem. The ultimate source of energy is the sun, though. But obviously, we can't just sit out in the sun and get the energy that we need. We need to consume food. So, how does that start? Producers provide energy for other organisms. So, producers, also known as autotrophs, you need to know both of those terms. Producers get their energy from non-living resources and make their own food. These are things like plants, but also there are bacteria that go through a process called chemosynthesis. If you'll remember, plants go through photosynthesis, where they take energy from non-living resources and make something usable for other organisms. Consumers, which are also known as heterotrophs, again, you need to know both of these terms, get their energy by eating other living things, such as plants and animals. Almost all producers obtain energy from sunlight, but we know that sunlight directly hits things like a leaf, and a leaf will have chloroplasts that run photosynthesis that will eventually make carbohydrates that we consume and get energy from. And part of photosynthesis is you also need carbon dioxide and water as well. And byproduct, besides food, is also oxygen. Most producers on Earth use sunlight as energy as an energy source for photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, again, converts light energy, or sunlight, into chemical energy, carbohydrates, which we consume, digest. Chemosynthesis was the other example I was using. This is organisms that make carbohydrates using chemicals instead of sunlight. We find this in deep sea thermal vents, and this is often bacteria are usually the ones that go through chemosynthesis. And often you find sulfur-rich marsh flats and hydrothermal pools that also run the same process. This can be the basis for a thriving ecosystem. These hydrothermal vents in these deep sea thermal vents have a rich biodiversity that isn't usual for deep sea. Food chains show the passage of energy through a system. And so this is a sequence that links species by their feeding relationships. Only follows a connection between one producer and a single chain of consumer. So it just shows a direct line of food. So below you can see algae that the zooplankton eat. Small fish eat the zooplankton, a squid eats the small fish, and a shark will eat the squid. And so this is a food chain. It's a direct linear process. And this is the simplest way to look at how energy can flow through an ecosystem. Now, zooplankton probably won't just eat one kind of algae, and small fish probably won't just eat zooplankton. So we also have to utilize food webs as well, which we will get into later. Now, there's multiple types of consumers. Here, herbivores are organisms that only eat plants. Carnivores only eat animals, and omnivores eat both plant and animal material. Now, herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores are all consumers or heterotrophs. You also, in a given ecosystem, need to have detrivores, which are really important to eating detritus or dead material. Things like earthworms and mushrooms and certain types of scavengers are considered detritivores. They break down dead material. Decomposers break down organic material into simpler compounds. So this is a specific type of detritivore. Fungi and bacteria are examples of this, and they're important to the stability of an ecosystem because they return nutrients back into the environment. Earth recycles everything. An organism may also focus on a single organism to feed on, and these are what we call specialists, or can have a varying diet, or be called a generalist. We would be considered generalists, for example. Trophic levels are levels within a food chain. So producers are always the first level. Primary consumers are the next level. These are always herbivores. Secondary consumers eat herbivores. So they could either be a carnivore or an omnivore. And then tertiary consumers are top-level carnivores that eat secondary consumers. And a food web shows a complex network of feeding relationships. Food web may have multiple feeding relationships, and the stability of food webs depend on the presence of producers that form the basis of food webs.